Hello and welcome to Motorsport Speak, a motorsport podcast brought to you by Motorsport Week and Motorsport Monday. My name's Dan Lawrence and I'm joined today by Jack Oliver Smith, our Formula E editor, and that's what we're going to be talking about, the second round of Season 11 of the all-electric FIA World Championship, the Mexico City E-Prix. Another exciting race following up from Sao Paulo, which we got in December before Christmas. But the new year's here, and so is round 2 of the Formula E season. And it was Oliver Rowland making amends for his no score in Brazil after some technical issues caused some strife for Nissan, but there was no such issues for them in Mexico. Rowland taking victory with a last-ditch attempt using attack mode. So let's get into it, Jack. Rowland taking victory, obviously being one of the consistent drivers and one of the standout drivers of last season, many tipping him for success this season. Things obviously didn't go well for him in Brazil, better in Mexico, qualifying fourth, and he was in fourth for just as we were getting to the end of the race. And then we had a safety car period, which bunched the field up, and he had a minute of attack mode, which he used pretty darn well. And in a space of a lap, managed to leapfrog 3 cars, including the much fancied Porsches, to take victory. So, did you enjoy the race? And what did you make of Rowland's victory?
Well, yeah, I did enjoy the race. It was a fair bit more exciting than last year, which was a slightly pedestrian affair by Formula E standards. But yeah, Rowland just did Rowland things. He's an incredibly opportunistic driver. He's got a lot of the all-round attributes required, and he showed that by being able to take his opportunity. Obviously got a little bit of fortune with the safety car, the second one, to then really up his chances even more of actually keeping the lead and keeping the win. And yeah, I just, and then he showed a lot of good defensive driving, which again is another good thing in his arsenal, which is, again, something that you desperately need in this championship. It was a deserved win purely on the fact that he stayed in touch with the Porsches for long enough to sort of keep himself in the race. And yeah, I think it kind of underlines the pre-season confidence from Nissan that they could go all out and really challenge this year. And I think that based on the pace they showed in Brazil and what they did in Mexico, I think that that's a pretty deserved label they've got.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, before it all came undone in Brazil, he was in contention, wasn't he, for victory there? Yes, it very much looked like we were going to get a Porsche 1-2 before we had that lap 28, end of lap 28 safety car intervention. And then I think we were talking about this before we came on to record. We were talking about attack mode and how it's different this year. You get that 50 kilowatts of extra power, but it's engaged through that the four-wheel drive coming into action. So you get that 50 kilowatts through the front axle. Whereas before, attack mode was more of a hindrance that you had to deal with because you lost track position and it was quite hard to recover it, even if you did have that extra power. The extra power and extra traction you get with attack mode this year has made it really, really overpowered. I think I was reading something. It was Nick Cassidy was the first to take it in Sao Paulo, and I think he went from 11th to 1st in this period of using his attack mode. So we know it's a powerful asset. Rowland had just over a minute of it to use. He was in 4th place, safety car restart on lap 31. By the time they got to the stadium section and another safety car came in, he was already in the lead. So really, really overpowered. You could argue. Would you say that attack mode's gone from one extreme to the other and it's too much? Or would you say that it's quite exciting having the attack mode being this useful an asset?
I think from the point of view of the drivers, they are happier that it's like this, because they, in pre-season testing, a lot of them spoke about how it just there was no point to it last season and probably the season before, just because you just didn't get much benefit out of it. You had to be so far in front. If you were the lead driver, you had to be so far in front of the other drivers for it in order to work, really. And we saw in the last round in London how much it threw things up in the air because Evans missed it, and the drivers were waiting till the last possible minute to actually take it because they just didn't want to take it. But of course, not taking it comes with a penalty. So yeah, the all-wheel drive just makes all the difference. It just actually makes it a useful tool now. Yeah, whether it's too much, I don't know. Again, it's all about the strategic element to it. You can take it in different bursts as long as you take your 8 minutes in some form or other, in some increment or other, you can. But I think that, to be honest, from a driver perspective, and they're the ones that have a lot to say about Formula E and the evolution of it, I think they're happier that it's like this than it was last season. So I think, to be honest, from the spectacle as well, the entertainment point of view, it just is just adding something to the championship that it was lacking before.
Yeah, I think, and you could also say it's the same for everybody, isn't it? So they're all playing with the same set of rules, and I think it's one of the charming things about Formula E, or one of the interesting things about Formula E, is these strategic elements more so than in other categories. Obviously, you've got attack mode, and obviously there is the nature of the conservation of your energy, which is so important. We saw obviously with McLaren that really paid dividends for them, and it gave Taylor Barnard the opportunity not only to secure a podium, but potentially attack those in front in Sao Paulo in those final laps. So yeah, but it's the tactical element involved. Also, I think as well, from an excitement point of view, as you say, yes, Rowland had that extra speed, that extra traction, but those were tight moves he was making. It's a tight, twisty technical layout, the Mexico E-Prix circuit, especially the sort of infield bits. And he was making some pretty do or die moves. He was going for it, and which is exciting to see. And it was clean but really hard racing. So I think that was good. But let's talk about Porsche, because obviously until those sort of final laps, they'd executed a really strong weekend. Obviously, Wehrlein and Costa locking out the front row, the pair of them basically exchanging hands at taking the lead, and it looked like it was going to be Costa's win before we had the safety car and Rowland's attack mode charge at the end there. So both Porsche drivers just looking really, really strong in Mexico.
Yeah, and I guess from a layperson's point of view, it ended up being a bit disappointing, because you go from locking out the front row, which is the first time Porsche ever have done this in Formula E, to just missing out on the win. But one of the things about Formula E that is key is that you just pick up points whenever you can and you chip away at it. If you look at the Costa season last year, he won more races than anyone else. He won 4. He ended up P5 in the championship because he didn't pick up as many points in the races where he didn't win races. So for him to take 2 P2s, and he's now leading the championship, and I think Wehrlein will be as equally as content, particularly as he's picked up 6 points for 2 pole positions. They're going to obviously be a bit gutted that they lost out right at the end, but I think that they're going to be pretty pleased with where they are after these first 2 rounds. And I think that they're probably the benchmark. And it will be interesting to see also how their customer teams will fare as a consequence, because Andretti seem a little bit more competitive in qualifying, which was their real downfall last season. I mean, Jake Dennis pulled some really good races out of his hat last year, when he just had some awful qualifying sessions just because of the way the car was. And Kiro as well, because David Beckman was running in the points for quite a lot of the race, and Dan Tickton was punted off quite early on, so we never got a chance to see how he could have fared. So the Porsche powertrain is the most competitive so far, and the works team do look insanely quick, particularly over 1 lap and under a different circumstance of race that we'll see them clean up in a few races, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things you said there. Talking about obviously picking up points wherever you can. Wehrlein obviously had that really scary crash in Sao Paulo, but as you say, he got pole position, so he still came away from that meeting with some crucial points. Not many, but he still scored points. And I think we've got to say as well that as a driver lineup, Wehrlein and Costa are up there as probably being one of the strongest in the field, and I think probably only the likes of Jaguar with Evans and Cassidy can really match that as a driver pairing. I think most of the other teams, they've got maybe 1 star and one maybe sort of sort of, I guess you could say, second driver, if that's fair. Sort of, you think Rowland's probably going to be the man doing the charge at Nissan, and similar, as you said, Jake Dennis at Andretti. Let's talk about Dennis. Obviously, Andretti had their qualifying struggles last year. It was an okay qualifying performance from him in Mexico. Obviously, in the top 10, finishing 7th in qualifying, and he was in the mix for a majority of the race, particularly the first half. Picked up the fastest lap and got 4th. So that was sort of a solid result there for the season 9 champion.
Yeah, he did cut a slightly miserable figure at times last season, and understandably so, because I think if their 1 lap pace had been a darn sight better than it actually was, there was a good chance he probably would have been on for a second successive title. Because again, he was mathematically in contention at the time of the first London race at the very end of the season. And how on earth he did that, I don't know. If the car is consistently better in qualifying, then we'll definitely see him win races, I'm sure. He is one of the top drivers in there, and of course he's got some Formula One pedigree as well, which is again, to the outsider, another sort of impressive thing on his CV. And it just, he is one of the best drivers out there, particularly on his day. It will be interesting to see how much closer Nico Muller gets to him, because he's had, in the last 2 seasons, he's been the dominant driver in the Andretti team. Norman Nato did have some good races last season, but ultimately fell pretty short of him. And the same in his title year. Andre Lotterer was not consistently performing anywhere near as well as Jake was, and he ended up winning the title. But that was probably the reason why also they partly lost out on the team's championship. So it's going to be an interesting dynamic, because Muller's highly thought of by Porsche and the Works team. So it'll be interesting to see what Dennis can do up against him this season. I suspect he will come out the top man again, but I think that they certainly look a stronger package this year, and from Jake's point of view, that's a huge bonus for him.
Yes, 100%. And I think, we were just talking about team driver pairings. I think there's one thing, the likes of maybe Wehrlein and Costa, Evans and Cassidy. I mean, you could, particularly for the latter pairing, if you think about last season, there's a case of having 2 elite drivers. They will take points off of each other in terms of the drivers' championship fight. Whereas maybe the likes of Dennis and obviously Rowland, particularly as well, they maybe don't have that much of an issue. But then conversely, if we're talking about attack mode, yes, losing track position isn't as bad as it used to be in Formula E, but you still lose track position, and having a teammate who's right on your tail, you can work with, have them as that buffer to help you not lose too much ground when you take attack mode is helpful. And maybe these drivers who are sort of being a bit of a one-man band in races, they don't have that tactical benefit of having a rear gunner for taking attack mode. So that's another interesting sort of facet to those sort of intra-team battles. One driver who probably looked like they could have been in contention and for the race victory until it all sort of unravelled was Jaguar's Mitch Evans. An amazing historic win to open his account in Sao Paulo, going from last to first. I think the racing gods and Lady Luck looked on him favourably there, but they came back to bite him in Mexico. I think when that the first safety car came in, he had 4 minutes of his attack mode to still use. And obviously, we've talked at length about how powerful an asset that is. He was in the top 8, so you could argue that he was really in the pound seat there to maybe go and use those 4 minutes and breeze his way to a second successive victory. But it was not to be, for he was in an incident that triggered the second safety car period, where he came across a Nico Muller that was slowing down. It sort of abruptly couldn't quite get out of his way, and they tagged, and it was a DNF for Mitch Evans, which I guess it shows the sort of roller coaster sort of nature of Formula E. You're on top one moment, you're rock bottom the next, and it's why these title fights are always so close. But a bit of a shame for Evans, wasn't it, really? And I guess with that 4 minutes of attack mode, it was a real missed opportunity.
Yeah, and in the first instance, for his sake, given the choice words he had for Muller on the team radio, I really hope Mohammed bin Sulayem wasn't listening. Yeah, it was a shame for him, because obviously the attack mode does provide so much extra power through the all-wheel drive, but it still takes a driver of considerable nerve to be able to, thread their way through through the pack. And Evans is very good at that, and so is Cassidy. Cassidy did that a lot last season. And Evans is the joint all-time race winner in Formula E. He's got equally the most amount with, I think, 2 others. So he's, we know what pedigree he's got, and we know that he could have made a game of it on Saturday. So it was a real shame for him. And it's little incidents like that that do decide a championship at the end of the day. And I suspect, as cool a customer as Mitch is, it will play on his mind a little bit if those incidents continue, because he's been so close to winning the championship for so many years running. He just has to knuckle down and think of every race they come as a new opportunity, because we all know he's got the chops to win the championship. He just gets let down by bad luck right at the end. So hopefully those sort of incidents will be few and far between this year.
Yes, well, maybe having the bad luck at the beginning of the season maybe it will work in his favour. But like you say, he's been in contention for both races, hasn't he? So he's off to a good start. I mean, we're looking at the title picture. We've kind of mentioned all of the title candidates already. Costa obviously looking very strong, 2 podiums. He's top of the standings with 37 points. And obviously the mixed fortunes across 2 races for the others means it's fairly tight behind him. He's got a 12-point buffer to Rowland and Evans, both on 25 points, and then Wehrlein there on 21. So obviously those are 4 candidates that I think we can pretty safely assume are going to be in the running for quite a long time. Obviously, someone with no points to his name and someone we'd probably be betting at the start of the season to be putting in a title challenge is Nick Cassidy. And obviously it's not gone his way in these first 2 rounds. And his weekend really came to an end in qualifying, didn't it, in Mexico?
Yeah. I spoke to him before the weekend really got going, and he was talking about taking all the opportunities you could get, but none of them really presented themselves to him on Saturday, which just again is another aspect of, if qualifying is bad, it's just not going to happen in the race. And that isn't the case in every single E-Prix. A lot of the team bosses that I spoke to prior to the weekend, and Nick as well, all talked about how qualifying was mega important around this track, because it's one of those circuits where more often than not, the driver who is the fastest is the one that's going to end up winning or be very close to winning. It's not a peloton race where you're going to get potentially a very unpredictable result. So I suspect he probably knew that the chances of him getting a good result on Saturday were done pretty much after qualifying. It's going to be interesting to see in races where it isn't as much of an issue how much he can pick up, because as I just said, he was very good last season of scything his way through. I think he got the tag of the Prince of Peloton in those races. He made the most of it. I mean, in Berlin, he went from, I think, right near the back to winning the race, or one of the races. So it's not lost for him. Nothing's lost for him yet. It's still early days. He's just got to try and hope that the Jaguar car is going to be a bit better in qualifying trim in the tracks where it is more important than the others.
Yes, I mean, we were talking, you were saying, weren't you, really, last year, Costa had the most race wins, but he had that pretty terrible start to the season, which meant that he was out of title contention. And yeah, let's look at we've got Cassidy's 4 title rivals are already at least 21 points ahead of him. So he's got work to do and ground to cover. Similarly, in terms of getting ground to cover in the teams championship, it's looking good for Porsche. Obviously, we've talked about their driver lineup being pretty potent. They've got 58 points. McLaren on 27 after their 3rd and 4th place in Sao Paulo. Jaguar on 25 and Nissan on 25. I think we've got 3 teams there that we can probably safely bet will be in the hunt for the long haul. McLaren perhaps maybe an outlier, and their challenge may fade. But let's talk a little bit about Mexico and the E-Prix itself. I think, as you were saying there, you touched on it, qualifying really important at this circuit. It's not a peloton race. It's a hard place to overtake without attack mode. I think we saw it was pretty much follow the leader until people started taking attack mode, and that's when the orders started changing and tactics came into play, which I think luckily spiced up the race. But I mean, it was a sellout crowd as well. This is kind of a Formula E legacy venue. We were speaking before we started the pod how it's been around since season 2. So, what were your overall impressions of it as an event and as a Formula E venue moving forward?
Well, it's got the longevity, which is a great thing, and I think the fact that this track is quite adaptable makes it an ideal venue for staying on the calendar in the years to come. One of the interesting things that the team principal of McLaren, Ian James, said to me on Friday was that he can see that once Gen 4 comes in season 13, there may have to be an acceptance, if you like, that there's going to be more purpose-built facilities on the calendar. It's cheaper for a start, but also the car might be more conducive to running on that sort of circuit. So Mexico, I think, has no issue where it comes to actually providing an entertaining race, and I think it will get more so the quicker the cars get. And yeah, I mean the crowd were absolutely fantastic. You know, you've got the stadium complex, which you get obviously where you've got the podium ceremonies, and you have in the Formula One as well. And they were going crazy for it. I mean, I think it was quite overwhelming for the likes of Rowland, who has probably, with all due respect, he's a fantastic driver, but he's probably not seen atmospheres quite like that in his racing career, because Formula E is just that much newer, and therefore that much nascent in its growing popularity. So I think the more we see sellout crowds like that and that sort of enthusiasm, it's only going to do Formula E the world of good.
Yes, and it's interesting what you said, obviously, about sort of Gen 4. These cars are going to be more powerful, more conducive to standard race circuits. And it's interesting when you consider that, when you talk about the Formula E sort of business model, for want of a better word, they really like these city-based venues. So, you know, you can sort of grab that new wave of younger fans. You know, it's easy for them to access, whereas traditional circuits tend to be sort of, you know, out in the cuds, you know, out in the wilderness. Mexico is it's very well placed for the Gen 4 era, you would say, because it is a city-based circuit, but at the same time, it's a Formula One ready venue. I mean, it uses a different extended layout for Formula One compared to the one it uses for the E-Prix, so it's kind of poised quite well to handle the transition from Gen 3 Evo into Gen 4, should sort of bigger and more expansive circuits be needed. We've already touched on it a little bit, or I touched on it in passing. McLaren obviously had that incredible result in Sao Paulo, 3rd and 4th, a wonderful podium for the youngster Taylor Barnard in his first race as a full-time Formula E driver. Things obviously didn't go as well for them in Mexico. Bird did qualify in the top 10, but there was no points on offer for McLaren again. And I think one thing I noticed from their season last year, obviously Bird getting that sensational victory in Brazil, it was kind of a highlight of a season that didn't have too many. And their ability to challenge right at the front wasn't consistent. I mean, we've only got 2 rounds in, but on balance, it's looking potentially like Sao Paulo as another flash in the pan. What do you think about McLaren? Obviously, they're a very young team in Formula E. What do you think? Are they going to be sort of nearly there? Is it potentially that Sao Paulo might be the best it's going to get?
The thing about McLaren is last season their season ultimately wasn't successful. It was great. They got their first win in Formula E, and it was only in their second season, which, you know, was an achievement. But I think you have to look at the broader picture and say that actually McLaren did have a lot of bad luck in a lot of races. Therefore, their overall position in the standings come the end wasn't as impressive as maybe their season was in a lot of other places. I mean, when they had Jake Hughes, you were guaranteed a very good one-lap driver, so he was able to get himself near the front of the grid. And then you've got Bird's experience in racecraft, which helped not just in Brazil, but there were other races where he did well. And of course, then when Barnard came in and stood in for him, he got double points in both the Berlin races. yeah, they're not going to be as quick as the Works Nissan team, obviously, but the powertrain is there, and therefore I think you can never discount them in certain races. Barnard, I think's already proved that he's got what it takes to be a Formula E driver. There's a certain sense of spatial awareness and nerve that it takes to be a Formula E driver, because the racing is so close and there is always a little bit of contact. And I think he's already proved he can cope with that pretty well. He doesn't seem to bulk under pressure either, which is, another great attribute. So I think, I won't discount McLaren coming out of this season with a win at some point. They did well in Brazil. They did well in Brazil last season. So it's kind of like almost now going to be like a traditional hunting ground, perhaps. But I think we will see a little bit more of them as the season goes on.
Perfect. And I guess a team that we will need to be seeing more of, considering they're only 2 rounds into their Formula E journey, is Lola Yamaha Abt. Not getting a point so far in their 2 races in Formula E. I think things were looking sort of promising for them. Zane Maloney getting a top 10 qualifying performance, which is no mean feat for a team that's only in its second ever round in the championship. I think you've got, well, I don't think I know, but you've obviously been doing some writing about Lola and sort of the unique structure that they have. It's a sort of a multinational outfit, the Lola element being from Britain. You've got the Japanese element of Yamaha and the German element of Abt. I think it's an interesting dynamic that they've got there. Sort of, how are you assessing their start to Formula E? And also, how do you assess that sort of multinational structure sort of guiding them through the season? Do you think it's going to be a benefit, or do you think it might be more of a hindrance?
Well, I spoke to Till Bechtolsheimer, who is the owner of Lola, before the race weekend got going, and he recalled this particular moment in the pre-season test in Harama, where there was a particular issue on the car. The Lola guys were looking at it, the Abt guys then started to look at it, and then the Yamaha guys got involved, and they all ended up coming together to resolve the issue. So it kind of bodes for it to be a sort of a super group, because you've got these very good minds from Lola and Yamaha that have come together to join up with the Abt team. They are a very well respected motorsport brand in not just Formula E but in other categories, so they've got a good pedigree. So I think that once it starts to gel more and more, you'll see it start to work and it pay dividends on the circuit. The fact that Lola and Yamaha took delivery of a Gen 3 Evo car in April last year shows that how far behind they are with everybody else, but they're not really showing how they're that far behind, because I wouldn't say they're necessarily the slowest car. The gap in Formula E is always very small, comparatively compared to other championships, and I think that they've shown that they've cut their teeth quite well already. So I think that, as Till said, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit with the team and the car, which can only get better as the season goes on. So hopefully you'll start to see them could challenge a little bit more in race trim. Maloney, again, like Taylor Barnard, I think is starting to show that he's got what it takes to be a Formula E driver. He's gone from F2 into this. He really is, by all accounts, the only genuine rookie, because he's the one that's come in and not raced in Formula E at any point. And in Brazil, he was running in the top 5 at one point, and he was incredibly enthusiastic after the race. Maybe he sort of started to realize himself just how much he can compete. And then getting a top 10 spot in qualifying sort of underlined that as well, at a completely different circuit. So I think he's also proved Lola right in what their choice was. They did speak to a lot of drivers, and some drivers, I guess, maybe weren't keen on it. Maybe they weren't keen on them. My understanding is that they upset Kelvin van der Linde by not giving him the drive, because being an Abt driver, or a former Abt driver, he felt he was nailed on to get it. But I think that taking Maloney, who's got more single-seater experience, has shown that it was the right decision. And I think that with him, his raw speed and talent, and you've got Degrassi's experience, particularly probably more when it comes to helping up with the setup and stuff, and also just with racecraft as well. I think that they'll be in the mix in some races this year, and I think that the long-term project, it bodes well already.
Yes, and I think one thing we could say is the next round, Jeddah, sort of could play into their hands a little bit because it's a new venue for everyone, so not just them. So let's look ahead to that now. We're heading to Saudi Arabia for a double header next. We're not in the sort of former venue of Riyadh. We're in Jeddah, and we're using a sort of an amalgamation, of want of a better word, of the Corniche circuit that is used in Formula One. So quite exciting to have a new venue. It'll be interesting to see how they cope on, because obviously there's a very high speed circuit as well. So we may end up with, this could be our first peloton races of the year potentially. How do you see the next round playing out in February?
Yeah, I think that's possible that we'll see a peloton race. We won't really know until the shakedown on FP1, because it's, as you say, it's a truncated version of the F1 circuit. The very quick go-karty bits of Sector 2 are not going to be used. So it will be, I think, a case of energy management. We're going to see more than likely the introduction of the pit boost. So we'll have potentially pit stops working in conjunction with attack mode, and I think that this is, as you say, it could be an opportunity for the likes of Lola, because if they can get that down to a fine art, get the pit boost down to a fine art, we could see them taking advantage of maybe teams that don't, because we have potentially 30 seconds of recharging in these pit stops, and if teams can be a little bit faster than everyone else, as we used to see in the old days with refueling in F1, we could see the order thrown up, and again, that's just going to add more points potentially on the board for the teams and the manufacturers that don't get as much of an opportunity to score points on a regular basis, and also for the likes of the drivers that know this circuit already, like Zane Maloney. Actually, it's going to be interesting to see what they can do. I think the only thing I can say is I think we'll probably have entertainment guaranteed, and I think that I think some drivers are disappointed that they're not going back to Riyadh, because some drivers really loved it. I know Cassidy did. So I think maybe he'll be on his guard as to how the race is going to run and how it's going to look. But from a Formula E perspective, it's great to have a big venue like this. And if it works, then again, it underlines what we could see in the future generations of the series.
Perfect. And I think that seems like a very good place to end, looking ahead to a new dawn for Formula E in Saudi Arabia. So, Jack, thank you for joining me today, and listeners and viewers, thank you for joining us. Make sure to like and subscribe to the podcast here on YouTube, or to consume it on Spotify, Apple Music, wherever else you wish to listen to us. Also, make sure to keep up to date with all the happenings at Motorsport Monday and www.motorsportweek.com, and follow us on socials at Motorsport Week on X, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and LinkedIn. But now, all we have to say is goodbye.